and just want to reiterate that we're really glad you're here, and welcome to Understanding and Addressing Evictions, a case study on leveraging data for social impact. So we are thrilled to have a chance to offer this conversation in partnership with the folks you see here. This event is co-sponsored by the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. And we want to announce that we have had a change to one of the panelists representing KC tenants. Jazz Hayes is standing in for Tara Raghuveer today. So we'll learn more about each of these panelists soon, but wanted to make those announcements and briefly let you know who I am and the organization that I work with and that you are able to be a part of this conversation with, because this is a part of the work that we do to pursue our mission. Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally is a volunteer-led national organization, and we are dedicated to increasing local civic engagement by people with STEM backgrounds. And this organization was launched by people with that type of background and with experience in public policy. And we are a tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organization. And I'm thrilled to be here with you. I am ESAL's managing director and have been with the organization since March. So I have seen firsthand what this group of really amazing individuals is able to do together. And one of the ways in which we pursue this mission is to have these really pointed conversations like the one we're having today. So want to just give you a little bit of an overview of the work that we do and how we do it, and hopefully help you see some ways that you might further your engagement with this work. So we are able to raise awareness by spotlighting the people who are doing local civic engagement and utilizing their STEM backgrounds for the good of their local communities. We're also able to explore ideas and highlight organizations through these different types of content. Stories from the field local STEM postcards are actually generated by anyone who's able to tell the story of how they've been engaged locally. And then deep dives that go into specific topics about providing all that you might need to know to get engaged at your local community. And so after we raise awareness, we really want to be able to provide ways that you can build your own capacity and that of your networks through skills development and just meeting the people who can help you pursue the type of work you're hoping to do. And finally, we have a group of tools and resources that we have made available mostly through our website, but also develop and offer in person in different types of workshops and sessions. So that's a little bit about the overarching work that we do. And some of the ways that we would love for you to be involved, if you're interested, is to, of course, stay connected and reach out to us. Let us know what it is you want to hear about, what you want to talk about, and how you could be better supported in doing this work. So you see our info@esal.us email here. We are also on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter through that esal.us/subscribe. I mentioned that you are able to be featured in the blogs that we put together and promote the work that you're doing and the people and ideas that you think should be raised up in this local civic engagement sphere. As well as you could be a part of the team that does this work. So right now we have a few open volunteer positions. And as I mentioned, the work of ESAL is almost led entirely by volunteers. So thank you to the events team who pulled this together, specifically Tony Van Whitson, Jake Passner, and Rebecca Mand, who are all behind the ESAL side of making this event possible. And we are looking for other events team members as well as some content and communications team members. Finally, if you're a part of an organization and you have a specific type of local engagement skill you want to develop, or just understand all the different channels and avenues through which you could impact your local community, we do offer workshops that are ranging in topic, but really intended to, again, equip you with the types of skills you need. So with that, I'm going to hand the virtual mic to Tony, who is going to introduce our panel and take us through the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Just to repeat, we have three very distinguished panelists with us today. The first is Professor Peter Hepburn. He is Associate Director of the Princeton Eviction Lab and also Assistant Professor of Sociology at Rutgers in New Jersey. The second is Alan Malik, Senior Fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington and the author of numerous books about cities and urban policy, including The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America, Bringing Buildings Back from Abandoned Properties to Community Assets, and Smaller Cities in a Shrinking World, Learning to Thrive Without Growth. And our third panelist today is Jazz Hayes with KC Tenants, a tenant advocacy organization in Kansas City. So all of them will have a lot to say about both urban policy and evictions in particular, and the important role of data in helping us understand evictions. So I'll turn this over to Peter and give him a chance to talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll talk to Alan, and then we'll talk to Jazz. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, appreciate it. Taylor, if you wouldn't mind starting to share slides, that'd be great. As Tony said, I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University at Newark and associate director of the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. And I want to talk about the work that we do using largely administrative data to try to understand the prevalence, the causes, and the consequences of eviction in America. So if you could go to the next slide. We are the Eviction Lab is a research group that's based out of Princeton University. We were founded by and we're directed by Matt Desmond. For those of you who are familiar with Matt's work, it's likely because of his book Evicted, which was this very important monograph that described the experience of communities, of individuals and families who are facing eviction in Milwaukee. This is based on years of ethnographic fieldwork that he did there in the city. And as that book started to find a broader audience, one of the questions that he got over and over again was, okay, I believe you that this is bad in Milwaukee, but what is it like here in my hometown? What does this look like in Cleveland? What is it like in Tampa? What's it like in Seattle? And the reality was that it was hard to answer that question, if not impossible. The federal government collects little or no data about eviction, and states vary widely in what data they make available, if any. It's very hard to really answer those questions without that sort of data being made available. So Matt set up the Eviction Lab with the goal of providing those data, of making this thing that had been a hidden housing problem much more visible. So we set out with the goal of answering sort of three big questions. Just how common is eviction in America? What are the causes and consequences of eviction? And what can we do to lower eviction rates, to make this less common? And the key kind of output of that work has been the development of a national eviction database consisting of over 100 million eviction court records that we've collected from around the United States between 2000 and 2018. And if you could go to the next slide, Taylor. Using those data, we've created sort of an atlas of displacement in this country. So this is a map of every single county in the United States, the eviction filing rate in 2018. We have these estimates for every year between 2000 and 2018. You can get a full picture of what eviction looks like across the country. Each of those little red dots that you're seeing is an eviction filing rate. If you could go to the next slide. Using those data, we've been able to find that on average, about 3.6 million eviction cases are filed every year across the United States against about 2.7 million unique households. So some of these households are being filed against more than once every year. On average, about 7% of all renter households, that's 1 in every 14 renter households, is filed against for eviction every year. Over the course of this almost 20-year period between 2000 and 2018, the number of evictions getting filed every year stays pretty constant. But the eviction filing rate has declined over time. That's largely because the renter population has gotten bigger, and it's tended to get bigger where there have been more older people, slightly better off people who are now renting their homes, and they're at lower risk of being evicted. We've also been able to show just how much variation there is between states in eviction rates. So that's a little hard to see on the national map, but Taylor, if you can go to the next slide, we can show this just graphically here. This is the share of renter households in each of the 50 states, plus the District of Columbia, who were threatened with eviction in 2018. So that varies from 1 in 7 households in South Carolina, 1 in 10 in Washington, D.C., 1 in 14 in New York State, but all the way down to 1 in 47 renter households in California. And those numbers are even lower in places like Wyoming, the Dakotas. So there's a lot of variation in what the threat of eviction looks like across the country. If you can go to the next slide. Using those data, we've also tried to address a series of questions such as who is it that's getting filed against for eviction? We've been able to document large racial disparities and gender disparities in the risk of eviction. Where are these evictions actually happening? Not just at the state level, but within states. We've shown that they're concentrated in certain neighborhoods and even specific buildings that are responsible for a really large share of cases. We've looked at the distribution of cases across urban, suburban, and rural neighborhoods. And we've looked at the ties between gentrification and eviction, which is a weaker relationship than many tend to assume. We've also tried to look for solutions to this crisis. We've conducted research showing that increasing notice periods, where tenants have more time to respond to an eviction notice, and increasing filing fees, the amount that landlords have to pay to file a case, can both be very effective in reducing eviction rates. If you could go to the next slide. So that's sort of where things stood before COVID-19 happens. But then we get this pandemic, and there's basically every reason to believe that the pandemic is going to make things much worse. By April of 2020, 50 million individuals were living in households that had experienced some sort of job or wage loss. And those job losses were really concentrated amongst exactly the sorts of people who were at greatest risk of eviction. You're talking about relatively low income people who were disproportionately renters and were disproportionately people of color. In response to that situation, the federal government really stepped up and took an unprecedented series of actions. We got 2 federal eviction moratoria and $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance. We also had 43 states, the District of Columbia, and 5 U.S. territories establish their own eviction moratoria. So there's suddenly a lot of risk and a big policy response, but we didn't really know what was happening in real time, right? We didn't have a way of evaluating whether there was a sudden flood of eviction cases and whether these policy interventions were working. So Taylor, if you could go to the next slide. What we started to build was what we call the eviction tracking system. And the goal of this tool was to use web scraping techniques to mine data that was made publicly available by courts in a number of jurisdictions around the country to track the number of eviction cases that were actually getting filed. We chose those sites, places where we had good historical data, the data from before the pandemic, so we could compare what we were seeing during this moment of crisis to what we saw under normal circumstances. And we wanted to build out tools that allowed us to map where these cases were happening, to look at the characteristics of those neighborhoods, the characteristics of the defendants on these cases, and to try to understand who was filing these cases. All of these we thought of as tools that would be useful for not just for our own research, but for journalists, for policymakers, for advocates who are working in the space at a moment of crisis. So you can go to the next slide. So the tool that we built a website to go along with this thing. It launched in June of 2020 with 11 cities. We now have 10 full states and 34 cities. We cover 1 in every 3 renter households in the United States. We've tracked almost 3 million eviction cases, including just in the last year, about 1.1 million. In August, we tracked almost 100,000 eviction cases. If you could go to the next slide. So using these data, we can look at what actually happened during the pandemic. What happened with eviction filings? What you're looking at here are eviction filings relative to historical average for every month from January 2020 through January of this year, 2023. So you can see right before the pandemic, those first two bars over on the left-hand side, eviction filings were right at normal levels, 100% of historical average. They start dropping in March of 2020 as the pandemic hits, and they bottom out in April of 2020. They start recovering over the summer of 2020, but then the CDC moratorium is put in place in September, stays in effect for almost a full year, and eviction filings are, at or below 50% of historical average during that period. They start increasing after the Supreme Court strikes down the CDC moratorium, but it's a gradual increase back up to basically average levels by January of this year. If you were to extend that to today, these numbers would continue to hover around 100%. So we've been at about normal levels for most of this year. But there's a lot of variation from place to place. So if you're in Philadelphia, where there's a well-funded eviction diversion program in place, those numbers are going to be a lot lower. If you're in my hometown of Minneapolis, unfortunately, eviction filings there have been about 60% higher than historical average for the last year. You can go to the next slide. So to give you a sense of some of the detail we want to provide sort of at the local level, here's an example of Columbus, Ohio. This is the same plot that we were looking at in the previous slide, but here extended all the way through last month, through August of this year. You can see there that eviction filings have continued to rise in Columbus relative to historical average. They've been about 30% higher than average over the course of the last year. On the next slide, we have mapped out where these eviction cases are coming from. So we can say that about 3 in every 10 eviction cases in Columbus come from one of just 100 buildings. That's the 29.1% on the left. And if you look at which buildings they are, you'll start to see the same names repeated over and over again. So Link Real Estate Group, 5812 Investment gets repeated over and over again. There are a relatively small number of buildings and an even smaller number of owners that are really driving the crisis in most of the cities that we look at. On the next slide, we've mapped this out so you can start to understand where these cases are happening. In Columbus, this is not heavily concentrated in sort of the downtown city core, but it's rather much more a periphery problem. It's increasingly the suburbs where we're seeing a lot of eviction cases. And then finally, the next slide, we have done some work using statistical imputation techniques to try to understand the racial and gender characteristics of individuals who are getting filed against for eviction. Taylor, could you switch that next slide? And we can compare to the composition of renters within these places. So as an example here, what we're showing is that about 1/3 of all renters in Columbus are Black. Almost half of the individuals who are facing an eviction case in Columbus are Black. We also show that women face a disproportionate burden of eviction cases in Columbus. That's true of every single site that we track. That's kind of gives an overview of the sort of data that we've assembled and how we're using that. That's all I wanted to share right now, and I'm eager for the conversation to hear what others have to think about this.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next speaker will be Alan Malik.
Okay. Oh. Oops, I've got to get back somehow. Oh, there we go. Screen. Sorry for a glitch here. I'm not quite familiar with how to use this new laptop I have. So I will get there. Okay, so I'm going to take a step back from where Peter was at and look at eviction in the context of the larger rental ecosystem, because basically rental housing and renters and landlords form a total ecosystem with a lot of interdependent moving parts, and eviction, in many respects, is an example of a failure within that system. And what I'd like to suggest is that for people, especially who are working locally on trying to deal with these issues, it's important to try to understand the entire system, and that there are some amazing and data sets that are available or that can be made available if a municipality operates proactively in this space to address this system. So to begin, this is my kind of rough graph of how the system works. And we're talking about a rental housing stock and a pool of renters in each community. And the renters have distinct demographics. The housing stock has distinct condition features, as well as age, size, occupancy, ownership, and so forth. And then you have the financial side, which is the rents that are being charged, and of course, the nature and the characteristics and the role of the landlords. So what this shows is each of the blue areas is a characteristic. The yellow ones are essentially system failures, and I guess it's some kind of a brown color, are areas of potential intervention in the system. Because ultimately, the purpose of understanding the rental system is to be able to intervene to address conditions that are inimical to the community and to the individual tenants who occupy the units, which are, again, unsafe and unhealthy conditions, unaffordable rent, and eviction. So this is the system. Now, how do you deal with this and look at it? Okay, the first thing is there is a lot of data available. I'll walk through this very quickly because, I mean, any one of these areas can be the subject of a detailed discussion and analysis. You have published data about population distributions, demographics, socioeconomic conditions, and mortgage lending, which sometimes allows you to get a handle on certain aspects of the rental stock. Those are published official data sets. In addition, there's a great deal of public records data, which can be mined by local activists or in some cases by local governments. So real estate transactions are recorded pretty much everywhere in the United States and are public record data. That data can get you through analyzing that data, you can get a good handle on absentee ownership. Tax data, vacant property data is available from the U.S. Postal Service and through an agreement they have from HUD. Foreclosures, eviction filings, and crime reports, which give you a sense of the context of the housing. Municipalities and others who want to build databases of this can get rental information, can create databases on landlords and rental properties by establishing rental registration requirements, which are increasingly common in most states of the United States. There are a couple of states where state legislatures, acting at the behest of landlord organizations, have limited or barred municipal power to impose rental registration requirements, but fortunately, these are still a relatively few exceptions, and proactive code enforcement. In addition, many communities are getting data on the condition of housing, at least exterior condition of housing, and the prevalence of vacancies by doing field surveys, which are now very easily done with their variety of technologies that allow people to walk or even drive down the street, enter information into a tablet or a smartphone, which then goes into real time to create a database. So an aggressive or a focused effort at creating a database in a community can be extremely powerful. Now, once you know this, then you can start asking very specific questions. First, about the properties themselves. Who owns them? How do you find them? What are the characteristics of the units? What rents are being charged? Now, these are all information that it is legal for a municipality to ask of a landlord, to require that they submit this information on a regular basis in, again, the great majority of states in the United States. I recommend, when I'm working with municipalities and advocates on this, that the rental registration include information, contact information for the individual tenants, not so much because the municipality needs to know who they are, but because it's important to notify when there are actions being taken by municipalities against landlords. It's important to be able to notify the tenants so they are part of that process rather than being essentially passive bystanders to the issue. Then it's important to understand the context. I think Peter's point about the link between gentrification and eviction being weaker than a lot of people believe is certainly borne out by my own research and experience. But on the other hand, it is very powerfully associated with such things as poverty, prevalence of female-headed households, and the relative cost of rent to incomes, and the availability of affordable subsidized housing. So understanding those factors, understanding the prevalence of substandard housing conditions, which are very widespread in most low-income neighborhoods in the United States, are all critically important to understanding the rental system, as well as understanding housing market activities. I think, landlord behavior in the final analysis is driven very heavily by their understanding of the nature of the housing market, of who are the renters, how much rent they can charge, whether their property is appreciating or not, how much they paid for it in the first place, and so forth. So understanding the market activity can be an important step towards understanding landlord motivations and landlord behavior, which of course are important issues in understanding the eviction process and especially trying to intervene in the eviction process. So the key interventions I would suggest are these. And I think, again, I want to stress the purpose of gathering all of this data is not so much to create a database for research, but to create the basis for effective interventions in the rental system. And there are two broad categories where interventions are particularly important. I would say one is the area of code enforcement and how you enforce not every last code necessarily, but how you enforce minimum health and safety conditions in the rental properties in the community and how you track them. And again, I stress that if you're going to do that, it has to be proactive. Simply responding to tenant complaints when they come in is not going to change the basic character of the rental housing. It may or may not fix immediate problems in a few cases. It doesn't solve the problem or make sure that people have healthy housing. And then the second broad category is intervening in the landlord-tenant environment. This is where eviction prevention programs become critical. In some states, rent regulation, intervening in landlord performance, by which I mean if you have landlords who are bad actors, many communities now actually require such people to participate in various kinds of remedial actions in order to clean up their act. And as well as providing incentives to good landlords and providing resources for repairs. In some cities where the market is weak, that you find a lot of landlords, especially mom and pop landlords, who simply don't have the money to bring their apartments or their houses up to reasonable code standards. So all of these are issues that need to be addressed by a community, and that you need to have the data to provide the basis for enacting them. So finally, a few observations. First, as Peter suggested, you can use data to become much more strategic about addressing the eviction issues in a community, understanding the hotspots, identifying the problem landlords, as in Columbus, and so forth. But a second part is that it's a dangerous fallacy to start thinking of landlords collectively as the enemy. There are bad landlords, there are good landlords. Having decent rental housing in a community is critically important. The way you get that, based for the most part, is by having responsible landlords who become a positive part of the community. And for that reason, having incentives, building a landlord support system becomes as important a strategy for a community as having the hammers to use against bad landlords. Third, local government is an essential partner, I think, in addressing the landlord-tenant issues and the condition and the future of rental housing. Ultimately, they have certain powers: the power to conduct property inspections, the power to require that landlords provide information, and so forth, that no nonprofit organization or neighborhood group has, no matter how strong or committed they are. Fourth, getting a good ordinance is just the beginning of a process, or a good program of any kind is just the beginning of the process. Everything that you do in this area requires continued hard work, effective outreach, and effective implementation. And in the end, just finally, the most effective programs are partnerships between local government and both citywide and community-based non-governmental organizations. You really can't do everything without local government, but local government can't do everything without the community. So I think this is a very quick overview of a very large and very complicated subject, but I hope it's been useful, and thank you. And
Thank
these
you,
just
Alan.
finally are a few resources that provide additional information from the Center for Community Progress.
Thank you, Alan. We will now hear from Jazz Hayes at KC Tenants.
All right. I will begin sharing my screen. All right. So my name is Jazz Hayes. I'm a leader with KC Tenants. And to start off my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about myself, introduce myself. My name is Jazz Hayes. My day job is as a data engineer, so it's great to speak to some fellow engineers and scientists acting locally as I do. And I'm a leader with Kansas City's citywide tenant union called KC Tenants. And my role with KC Tenants has largely been focused on research, data collection, and analysis that informs the union's work. That work ranges from organizing building tenant unions, writing and advocating for policy that protects tenants, informing tenants of their rights, all the way to stopping eviction court. Personally, I'm a lifelong Kansas Citian, and not only that, but I have a personal stake in this work. I grew up in poverty myself and have faced housing insecurity for most of my life. We talk a lot about, when we're talking about data, we talk a lot about numbers. And KC Tenants has an eviction data set with over 1.2 million records. But these are human beings that we're talking about. In fact, my own family exists within that 1.2 million record data set. My mother had an eviction filed against her in the state of Missouri when she was pregnant with me. So I have a large stake in this, and I am a self-taught programmer that became a data engineer and have used that to help KC tenants, the citywide tenant unions, work in collecting data. And I'm not staff with KC tenants. I'm volunteer. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. About KC tenants as an organization. Like I said, KC Tenants is the citywide tenant union. We're an organization led by multi-generational, multiracial, anti-racist base of poor and working class tenants in Kansas City, Missouri. KC Tenants organizes to ensure that everyone in Kansas City has a safe, accessible, and truly affordable home. We believe that people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. To us, organizing is fundamentally democratic. It relies on developing tenant leaders to learn their rights, tell their own stories, and determine their own liberation. So while I may be a member of KC Tenants, I am by far the face of KC Tenants. There are a lot more people in it in KC Tenants than I. In fact, I'm a relatively small part. As you can see in this photo of us at a rally, I'm in the background here, but there's a whole lot of people beside me. Yeah, we're a group of poor and working class tenants fighting for our own survival. Some things that we've actually done and won include a tenant bill of rights. So a certain list of legal protections for tenants in Kansas City enumerated in city code. We've also gotten a tenant's right to counsel. On this image on the right, you can see actually us standing behind our mayor, the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, signing the law to guarantee tenants a right to an attorney when they're facing an eviction. We've also passed and funded an Office of the Tenant Advocate. What that means is it's a department of the city government specifically dedicated to connecting tenants with resources when they're facing a crisis or need to address an issue with their landlord. We've also done a lot of direct action. We've disrupted eviction court. We did this for a whole month in January of 2021 during the height of the pandemic. When the national eviction moratorium was lifted, it was unsafe for court to convene in person. And so despite being too unsafe to convene in person, it was still safe enough to throw people out of their homes. So one thing that we did was we called into the virtual courts and disrupted court and prevented evictions from happening for a full straight month. Some cases were in person, and so we would stand outside the courthouse and block the court from doing its business of throwing people out of their homes. We've also passed a housing trust fund with a $50 million bond through a ballot measure. We have formed neighborhood tenant unions throughout our city. We have taken away millions from gentrifiers. So it's very common for gentrifying landlords to come in and build extravagant, unaffordable housing in our neighborhood, and then have the nerve to come and ask the city government for tax incentives and subsidies to do that. And on a number of occasions, we've stopped that. We've stopped notorious property investors and landlords from doing that. And we've also built building-wide tenant unions. So when a particular property is having a really atrocious issue or a rent increase or something like that, we've come in and organize the tenants of that complex or of that building, so that those tenants can act collectively and force their demands to be met. So this is a panel about eviction data. So a little bit more, so some background on our eviction data. So before KC Tenants had even existed, some folks who eventually founded KC Tenants knew pretty early on that it was going to be a very useful tool and not only informing policy, but also organizing a tenant union. So we started by a one-off request from one county spanning about 20 years, and it included about 200,000 records. Since then, we have expanded that data set to the entire state of Missouri over the entire period that is digitally available, which goes back about 30 years and totals about 1.2 million records across the state of Missouri. This is done using web scraping, and that's actually a large part of where my role comes in. So professionally, I'm a programmer. I'm self-taught, but I've applied those skills to write a web scraper, which introduced a number of technical challenges that if you're interested in, I'm sure I would love to explain. But that data set is updated nightly, and we geocode the addresses of the tenants in those eviction records for spatial analysis. So with that, we can do things like map out where evictions are happening, match those to property records to determine which properties are having higher rates of eviction. And some key insights we've had include some things that would normally be considered pretty obvious to the people that live here in Kansas City, but it's worth validating through actual data. So for example, historical patterns of segregation. Kansas City has a very long and nasty history of legally enforced segregation. And that's resulted in a concentration of people of color, particularly Black people, and particularly east of a street in Kansas City called Troost. So for a long time in Kansas City, it was quite literally illegal for Black people to live west of what is called Troost Avenue. And this created a concentration of Black people east of Troost that still exists to this day, despite the legal environment changing on the books. And that concentration of our Black population also correlates with a concentration of poverty, and therefore a concentration of eviction filings. So it shows in our data set, and you can see a map here on our right. It's a quick and dirty visualization of mapping the number of court order eviction filings as a percentage of renter-occupied housing units. This was for a particular 4-year period, but this pattern stays the same no matter what time period you look at. The purple line right down the middle you can see is Troost Avenue, and you'll see it's pretty white to the left of it and very green to the right of it. So, you know, if you're from Kansas City, this is probably completely unsurprising, but it's validating to have the data to reinforce that common knowledge. Another key insight that we've learned from our data set is that only about 3-ish% of tenants have a lawyer when they're facing eviction. This creates like a huge imbalance in the power relationship between a landlord and tenant when they go to court. And that has informed public policy that I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Another thing that we've learned from this data is we've taken the eviction filings and overlaid them on top of property records. And using that, we can know who owns a given property. And we found that out-of-town landlords file about 63% of evictions. But a lot of our most interesting insights have come from cross-referencing with other data sets. And there's about 1 million different ways we've done this, and I won't get into all of them, but our city has a program called Healthy Homes, which is a subdivision of our health department where tenants can file a complaint with their landlord about unhealthy housing conditions. And we can see correlations with eviction filings and healthy homes complaints. There's a ton of different permutations and combinations about how we can use this eviction data set. Our eviction data set's really only one of the data sets that we use when we talk about housing and issues facing renters, houselessness, and affordable housing in Kansas City. Some ways that we use our eviction data, it's not just about research. As much as research is great, we're a tenant union, and so that means that we act locally to act collectively. One way this looks is it informs policy. So like I said earlier, only about 3% of tenants have a lawyer when they face eviction court. And so one way of addressing that problem is what's called a tenant's right to counsel. And what that means is when a tenant is facing an eviction filing, the city government of Kansas City guarantees the right to an attorney. They'll pay for it and everything. You just need to call a phone number and get hooked up with the program. Our eviction data set also helps with policy implementation. So for that particular policy, if you have a right to an attorney, but you don't know it, it's not a very useful right. One way we've used our data set to help policy implementation is actively reaching out to tenants who are facing eviction to inform them of that right. So like I said earlier, our eviction data set is updated nightly using a web scraper. And so we're actually working with the city government to on a data sharing agreement where we can, not to get in the weeds too much, but our city actually has a complicated political geography where our city limits spans across 4 different counties, and only one of those counties has agreed to share their court filings with the city government. The other 3 have not entered in such an agreement. So KC Tenants has stepped in to fill in those gaps, and we're using our live eviction data to feed that data into the city government so that they can actually write letters, send them to the addresses on the eviction filings, and let tenants know when the eviction is filed that they have a right to an attorney, and that the city will pay for it. Another way that we use our eviction data is for tenant outreach. I've shown some pictures of what KC Tenants looks like, and that's because of base building. It's because of canvassing. We're a tenant union, and a tenant union is only as strong as its members. And one way we build our membership is through canvassing. How do we know where to canvass? Well, a lot of that has to do with the where impacted tenants are. And so one way we use our eviction data set is to look at the highest evicting properties, and we quite literally just go to those properties and knock on the doors of the tenants. We go and talk to them about the issues facing them. We let them know about things like the right to counsel and other rights they have, and invite them in to join our collective in addressing their own problems and fighting for their own liberation. Another form of tenant outreach that we do with our eviction data is like I said, with Zero Eviction January, when we stopped eviction court for a whole month, each week, because eviction court takes place on the same weekday every week. It's I think it's a Wednesday. And so each week before we'd go to the courthouse or call in into the virtual court, we would actively reach out to the tenants who are on the docket for that week using our data set and connect and ask them about their stories and invite them into the process. These are human beings we're talking about. These aren't just numbers. And so we want to hear from them, and we want people facing evictions to be centered in the solutions of the violent system that they're facing. Another way that we've used our eviction data is in conjunction with school districts. So we've worked with the local Kansas City public schools to reach out to parents and guardians of students facing evictions, and to provide support, connect them with resources, and to let the teachers know what's going on in the house. There's a bunch of different ways that we use our eviction data beyond just research, and actually use it in practice. There's a with a data set of 1.2 million records going back 30 years, there are countless, innumerable ways that we could use this data. And honestly, we haven't even really scratched the surface on it. Some ways that we could more effectively use this data include statewide organizing. So since our data set is statewide, and we have a number of preemptions on the state level, preventing local action, we could use our data statewide to inform statewide efforts, statewide tenant union organizing. And we've done a bit of this, but we could certainly do more of that. A lot of our research and a lot of our practical uses of the data set has been on the western side of the state. But also we could use this data set to more effectively identify worst offending landlords. One major barrier to this is LLCs. LLCs are a really, court records are messy within themselves, but it becomes even further complicated when a corporate landlord will have 10 different LLCs by different names, and it's difficult to trace where all of them lead back to. And so we can get a list of top evicting landlords. We can easily get a list of top evicting, parcels, top evicting units, and we can even do particular LLCs, but connecting those LLCs and the complicated legal structures behind them is a major barrier in more effectively identifying those worst offending landlords. And that, I think, concludes my presentation about KC Tenants, what we've done with eviction data to date, and how we could use it in the future.
Thank you very much, Jazz. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for what I thought were just wonderful, very enlightening presentations. As a person who is in love with data himself, I really got the impression, both listening to your presentations and reading some of what you do, that you not only eat, sleep, and breathe data. I think some of you dream data at night too. It certainly showed in the way that you've integrated data into both your thinking and your decision making. But what I hope to do in some of the questions was to get into some of the nitty gritty of what you actually do and how you actually do it, so that those of our members who might be interested in using data for their own social justice projects might be able to get some sense of where you start and how you deal with some of the problems that arise. So I just like to start by asking Peter, I know from having read a good deal about the Eviction Lab, what their ideals were. How did they start? Did they start with an ideal? Did they start with data? And I guess I'm asking, how did the two come to integrate? When did you decide that data was an important part of your mission and what you wanted to accomplish?
I mean, I think we knew from the get-go that if we wanted to answer the question of just, how many evictions are happening in America, you have to have some data to be able to address that question. So it's always been motivated by that sort of those central questions of how common is this? Who is it affecting? What are the consequences for individuals and for communities? And then what can we do to try to make this a less common event? And I think in addressing all of those questions, you need to have court records. And as much as possible, you need to figure out ways to link those court records onto other sources of data that would allow you to get at sort of the bigger questions. I mean, just like what Jazz was just talking about there, about trying to trace back LLCs and understand who the really kind of the bad actors are in markets. The court records aren't going to be enough there, and just the parcel data aren't going to be enough. You need to start getting into tax data and other sort of resources that would help you make those linkages, which are really complex, and it's really hard work to do. But there's so much more data that is now available about city governance and ownership and taxes than has been available previously that can help us to start to answer some of those questions. And I think that's an exciting place to be.
At what point did you realize that you were going to have to build a data infrastructure of your own, and what were some of the challenges?
I mean, I think we knew that from the get-go, and as we started building out the eviction tracker during the pandemic, we knew that was going to be something that was going to have to be sort of built in relation to the existing national database, but was a new project. And using the same sorts of techniques that Jazz was talking about, the same sorts of web scraping techniques, we could learn from some of the lessons that we picked up over the course of building the national database, but we needed to build a new infrastructure to do this work in real time. That was a different challenge than we'd faced previously.
And what lessons did you learn building that national database? I read your methodology report, and it was a fascinating journey through the project of building out a large database.
Yeah, no, it was enormously challenging. And to be perfectly clear, I joined the lab just after that national database launched. But there were, working with millions of court records, you start to realize that these are, as all administrative data is, these are messy records. There are duplicates, there are addresses that are entered wrong. There are going to be problems in geocoding. In each time you run into an issue like that, or an issue that recurs over and over again in the data, you're going to need to make a series of decisions. And having those decisions documented, which we do in our methodology report, also provided a framework for us moving forward and building out this new database during the pandemic. And that was definitely really helpful to have in-house.
Jazz, I'd like to ask you something like the same question. I saw you nodding when Peter talked about how data are messy. How did you face the same challenges working on a smaller scale and working on a lower budget with volunteer labor?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that court records are very messy. A lot of that data is manually entered, which introduces a whole host of human error. The way that, kind of what Peter was getting at, which is, looking at what those errors, look like as they come along and start accounting for them. It's kind of a learn as you go process. You start with sort of the just collecting the raw data, just going out there and getting everything that you can in its rawest form, taking a step back, looking at it and saying, what's useful here? What is very clear? What are the problems immediately present here, and how can we account for it? And you know, the way that we've addressed it with you know, a smaller budget, volunteer-led. Fortunately, when I wrote a lot of the code for this, I happened to be unemployed at the time. I've got a full-time job completely separate from this at the time. I mean, right now. But at the time, it was actually during Zero Eviction January. So in between going to the courthouse and holding up signs and chanting, I was going home writing code and looking at these giant data sets, thinking like, why is everything so weird here, and what can we do to make it a little more useful? So it certainly helped that I had a lot of time. I had a few other analysts and programmers with a little less time to help me out. We are a volunteer organization, but we've got a lot of people who really care about this. A lot of people just like me, personally impacted by the issue, that want to make sure that we're doing something about it, and not just standing by and letting you know, the landlords and you know, run the show, and the regulators stand by and let it happen.
Alan, you said something that I thought was really interesting. You said how eviction is a failure of the housing ecosystem. You're also very deeply immersed in data. Was there something about the data that you gathered that taught you that in some way?
Well, I don't know if it's the data so much. I think it's kind of pretty clear on its face that when somebody involuntarily loses their home, that's a problem. That's a system problem. It's not just a fault of some individual, whether it's a nasty landlord or a irresponsible tenant or something. It's a problem of the system. And that was kind of, I think, a basic understanding. But I think the data comes in is, how do you understand systems? You don't understand them by just sort of looking at them or trying to wing it. You understand it by grabbing all the data you can about this and analyzing it so you can get a comprehensive picture of the system. So it was really kind of, I guess, a little bit the other way around. The insight came from basically kind of gut understanding of what's going on, and then you use the data, to build your real understanding of how the system is working, and then hopefully can answer questions like, why are there so many evictions? Or what are the drivers? What are the hot spots, and so forth? You can only do that if you understand the system.
Have data ever changed your views on something? I mean, you said you had insights, and you've obviously reinforced those with data. Have you ever found data that caused you to think about something very differently?
Oh, constantly. I, without necessarily citing any examples, I think that's really a critical part of the process of using data, is keeping your mind open to the basic notion that your preconception of what's going on may be wrong. I think, one thing, I think I'll give one example, is I'm sorry about that. I just have to talk over it. The question about what correlates with the frequency of evictions. And about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to get a database of evictions from Baltimore, and ran it against just about every demographic or market variable that I possibly could, and found, again, that, as Peter had mentioned before, that the correlation with gentrification really didn't stand up significantly. But what correlated was poverty, race, and the ratio of income to rents, because which of course is a reflection of to what extent the market contains affordable and subsidized housing and vouchers versus people being essentially on their own in a private market.
Thank you. Peter, what do you do when you've got questions you can't answer with the current data? Do you look for more data? Do you try to use the existing data more ingeniously? Do you use more advanced techniques like imputation, for example? Or do you go out and start to, walk the ground and search for more data?
Some combination of all of those things, really. For that and coming up with different questions. I think one of the real challenges of working with court records like these are that they are very thin data. I mean, these are going to tell you there's going to be a case number, there's going to be a defendant, a plaintiff, a filing date. In some jurisdictions, you'll get information about how much money was at issue in that case. But even with a completed docket, you don't necessarily learn much about who's really involved there. And that could mean, who's really involved from the landlord side, but also who's really involved from the defendant side, who's actually, living in this house. If I want to know how many kids are at risk of eviction, those kids aren't listed on an eviction case. Like I can't see them through those court records.
So it's a blurry picture.
It's like a tiny window into these situations. I don't know why in many cases these cases are really coming through the court. I don't know what happens to these households afterwards. How many of them are able to stay in the unit? How many of them, if they're forced out, where do they go? What repercussions does this have for their economic well-being, their long-term housing stability, for their kids? How do their kids do in school afterwards? And it's been a long process of piecing together other databases that we can link to our records to start to get at some of those questions. So, for instance, I'm working on a project with the Houston Independent School District, where we've been able to link eviction records that we collected in Harris County to registration data from the from the school district to try to understand what happens to kids when their parents get filed against for eviction. But it's hard to do because we don't have social security numbers. We don't have a unique identifier. So we have to do a lot of matching on names and addresses, which is imperfect. But there also are questions that we're asking where the solution is not to gather more quantitative data or to do more data linkage, but it's to remember that there are a lot of other sorts of data that can be gathered and to do the qualitative work. I've worked with a number of collaborators to do mixed methods research where we are analyzing the quantitative data, but then we're also going out and talking to people, whether that be tenants or landlords or public housing administrators, to try to understand what's driving the patterns that we're able to observe in the quantitative data. And that combination of kind of the firsthand qualitative perspective with the quantitative perspective has been, I think, really powerful in better understanding these sorts of data.
Great. Jazz, at what point do you feel you have enough data or have the right kind of data to start informing public policy? And what do you do with the data, that kind of data, once you have it?
I mean, to be honest, a lot of public policy doesn't so much come from data as it comes from lived experience. So we have a massive base of poor and working class tenants, and we know that we know the problems that we face, and we've got some sense of an idea of how to address it. Where data is useful is convincing the people who are not personally experiencing it. So when we're looking at, and I like to go back to right to counsel because it's a very clear link between the data and the policy. you know, a lot of our members in KC Tenants,
Mhm.
we know personally that going through eviction court is really difficult.
Sure.
It's a complicated legal system. You're scared and alone.
Mhm.
And like it doesn't take data to know that.
Mhm.
The place where data comes in is where we can take a step back outside of our own lived experience
Mhm.
and look at it systematically and say,
Mhm.
you're not alone. You, it's it is just you in this court system, but it shouldn't be. And the way that we can address that is go to policymakers and say, here's this problem. Here's the data to show that this problem actually exists.
Mhm.
Tenants very rarely win their eviction court cases.
Mhm.
And a large part of the reason for that is they don't have a lawyer. Landlords, by their very nature, have access to things like capital to pay for attorneys to evict their tenants. Tenants, often by their very nature, especially ones facing eviction, don't have the money to pay for a lawyer. If they did, they'd have money to pay the rent.
Mhm.
And so, um, you know, the data so much doesn't inform public policy quite so much as it reinforces
Mhm.
a narrative around the need for public policy for those who aren't directly experiencing it.
Okay, great. We have about 14 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask Taylor if she's got any questions or if she's got a question from Jake that you'd like me to ask.
Well, I saw that, Peter, you had wanted to answer one submitted through the Q&A while we're here together.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a question about how often we collect and publish data. For the work that we're doing in real time, that's we're collecting that on a weekly basis. We update it every month. Yeah, the current that if you go to the website right now, we have data through the end of August. There are a couple of jurisdictions we work with where our process is a little bit more manual. And data can be delayed by a month or two. But for the most part, we're within the last month.
Great. I can't see the questions. Taylor, you're either going to have to give them to me or can our panelists see the questions? Would they like to volunteer some to answer one of them?
Sure, there is one more in the Q&A. Would anyone be able to speak to how the short-term rental market and the recent domination of that market by large out-of-town landlords affects evictions?
I will say that is not data that we're currently collecting, but it is a pretty hot topic in Kansas City. Short-term rentals are very unregulated, and there's outside of KC Tenants, there's a number of neighborhood associations, and things like that that are working to regulate short-term rentals. They've dabbled in data collection analysis, but really we should that's something we should definitely be looking at. That's a great question. You know, there are whole neighborhoods that are being swarmed by short-term rentals. And if I had to guess, it probably has a correlation with a decrease in evictions, considering there aren't any long-term renters there to evict. But that's a very interesting question, and certainly gives me ideas about what we can do with that.
Great.
Yeah. I'll second that. We don't have data. So the short answer is we don't know. But the long answer is there is likely to be a powerful relationship, and we need to get the data. And especially as more cities are starting to regulate short-term rentals in fairly serious ways. I know Jersey City has adopted and won a court case against its ordinance. I would call it a medium strict regulation. New York City has just implemented a very strict regulation ordinance on short-term rentals, which is likely to cut it back significantly. And I think clearly more short-term rentals reduce the supply of long-term rental housing and are likely to have an upward effect on rents, and which in turn is likely to have an upward effect on evictions. But we really should we need to document that if we're going to be able to really use it as a weapon in addressing this issue and fighting for effective regulation in places that don't have it.
Okay, great. Taylor, do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yes, so we just received one from Jordan. What advocacy points would you recommend for pushing a city toward creating a rental registry?
That's a great question. Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
No, no, Peter, you.
Well, I mean, I think this gets at something that both Jazz and I have talked about, is that like when you start dealing with LLCs, it's very hard to know who owns what. And if we don't know who owns what, then how do we hold people responsible? I mean, I think there are all sorts of problems with where the beneficial ownership of properties has been obscured to such an extent that we actually don't know who to contact if something catches fire or if there is a serious code violation. And rental registries force transparency. And I think that's critical to the functioning of the city. And I'm sure, Alan, if you have other thoughts here.
Okay, what Peter said is the threshold critical point about a rental registry. If you don't know who to reach, if you don't know who owns things, basically you're behind before you've even started. But beyond that, and going to Peter's point about relating this to the other impacts and what's happening from the very thin court records, you can get a database about the properties, about who lives in them, how many kids live in that property, how many bedrooms, what are the rents, how have the rents increased. You can start to understand the dynamics of what's happening and what's behind the surface of the eviction data. And that's critically important if you want to make your city a better place.
Great.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd
Jeff.
like to speak on that as
Sure.
well. In Kansas City, actually, we have something of a rental regulation policy. The issue comes down to, like a lot of things, is implementation. So you can actually go to Kansas City has an open data portal where they publish a whole bunch of different data sets. And related to this question, they publish what's called the LLC registration, which is if an LLC owns property, rental or otherwise, in Kansas City, they need to register through this program who is actually behind that LLC. The issue is it's a really terrible data set. Like it's outdated. Not very many LLCs are actually registered. There's barely any teeth to actually enforce it. And so, just like everything else, the issue comes down to implementation. Are there fees to penalize LLCs who aren't complying? Is there a bureaucratic staff funded and staffed to actually implement it, to research all of the LLCs and the parcels and the property records to actually, find out who is even offending it? We need essentially a law enforcement, a code enforcement for landlords and property owners to comply with the laws that already even exist.
Yeah, I'll just like to second that. Some cities seem to have the impression that the solution to something is to pass the ordinance mandating it. Landlords aren't simply going to walk into City Hall and register just because somebody passed an ordinance. You've got to do outreach, you've got to do enforcement, you have to have, some penalties if they don't comply. You have to make sure they know about it. It's an ongoing process. You have to think that through, and it never stops. You can't simply at one point say, okay, we've got everybody registered, we can coast. It's an ongoing process, and it's absolutely critical.
Great. Well, I'd like to throw this out to just about anyone there. What advice would you give someone who wants to use data to advocate around a local justice issue? Where should they start? Should they start by collecting? Should they start by advocating? Should they start by fighting for data? How can they best use data and leverage data to support the arguments they want to make?
I'll say, like I said earlier, a lot of it comes from lived experience. But if you want to dabble in data, the place I would suggest you start is not try collecting your own data like we have, but use what's already out there. Like I was saying with Kansas City in particular, we've got a whole website dedicated to publicly available data sets for data that the city already collects. Chances are, if you live in a mid to large metropolitan area, your city has the same thing. So I'd check that out. If you really have a niche question that you want to answer, like eviction filings and court records, then you can get in the technical weeds of collecting your own data. But that's how I would say you'd start.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I would also say, as you're exploring the data that are available to you, learn how those data were actually collected. Things that look self-evident at face value may be a lot more complicated when you really dig into like what the mechanism was that led to the creation of that data. And I think it's really important to understand where data come from and before you start using them. I mean, because otherwise there are a lot of ways to misstep. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It's just like they used to tell you, don't eat that. You have no idea where it came from. Don't just that. Yeah. The other thing I just say is, look, there are often people who can be very helpful, either in city government or I think, there's an organization called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which has 30 or so affiliates in different cities around the country with groups of people who are knowledgeable about data in their communities and are potentially eager to help. So do all of that. And I think one other point, you should have a pretty good idea of what areas and issues you want to advocate for before you start, because you don't want to just sort of do a massive data dump of gathering everything about everybody all at once. It doesn't work. So you should have sort of balance your data gathering activity with trying to have clarification about what issues you want to fight about and what goals you're striving for.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all three of our guests once again, Professor Peter Hepburn, Alan Malik, and Jazz Hayes. I'm now going to yield the floor back to Taylor just to wrap up, and I hope put in a nice one.
Cut out a little, Tony, but happy to step in. Well, thank you all. That was incredible just to hear how your experiences have so many overlaps, but also have provided, again, the reiteration for points in which we can all hopefully take something actionable away and navigate some of these challenges, but opportunities, and then coalition building in our own localities. And that's really what we hope, is that folks have found something in the conversation that allows you to take your next steps. And if you need other tools and resources, ESAL, Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, is here. We have a lot publicly available. But if you ever run into a question or something that you're looking for about how to do the work at local levels, feel free to reach out to us. info@esal.us. Again, my name is Taylor Spicer, the Managing Director. I'm also available and happy to help in any way possible. We hope to continue bringing more conversations around use of data and by local governments, by local communities. And so you can look for some follow-up pieces in the near future. But there are other topics we'll be exploring between now and then. I believe our next event will be focused on public health and particularly use of new prevention and harm reduction methods to help address abuse of opioids in our communities. So we'll be sending out more details about that. And I hope we can all stay connected in different ways and find each other and use each other in strengthening the work that we do. So just glad to be here with you all today and look forward to what's to come. Thank you, Tony, for moderating and keeping us all in line.
Thank
you.
you.
Really great experience. So thank you, Peter.
And one last shout out to our
Yeah.
guests. Thank you so much for some wonderful discussions there.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot. Bye.